13. That's where we're going to be picking up in our text this morning. As we think about Numbers 13, one of the things that stands out about this, of course, is verse 1 and 2. Notice the certainty with which God spoke here. The certainty with which God gives this message. In verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." Now notice that key phrase in the first part of verse 2, and pair that with Bill's reading, of course. In verse 2, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." All right, so this is going to be important. God has told his people, you are going to have this land. It's going to be yours. I am going to give it to you, not because you're great. The land is great, but that's not really why you're getting it. You're going to get it because I am gifting it to you. I will give it to you. That is certainty from a God who is faithful and always keeps his promises. The title for our lesson this morning on the screen is "What Catches My Eye." What I want us to focus on in a tough time right now is kind of being a beacon of optimism, both in what we're looking at now and looking back on it in the future. Knowing that A, there is a future to look forward to, and that B, there's some good to be had even right now. You know, God had promised them that this would be okay, but in the time, we know from Bill's reading, and certainly from knowing the story, people of Israel didn't really see it that way. They didn't see it as a slam dunk that this would be the best move ever made. And so what I want us to think about is the idea of looking at what we have from the right point of view. You know, it's possible to look at the same instance and have a different opinion on it. There was a debate 5 or 6 years ago with a prominent creationist and evolutionist. And the evolutionist was talking about evidence for evolution, evidence to be an atheist, or at least to be agnostic. And I thought the creationist said something that was very important, and this should shape the way we think and how we reason, not only with each other, but certainly in understanding the scriptures. He said, there is no Christian evidence and there is no atheist evidence. There is only evidence. And we have to look at, what do we do with that evidence, right? And when we see creation, do we say this was put here on accident, this was random chance, or do we say this was by design? And there are some people, in fact, many people, millions of people who believe it was by design. And there are some, many millions that also think, no, it was random chance. And they would say their evidence, or what they look at, determines their reality on that no, it must have been randomly poofed into existence. Now you think about that and you'd say, well, I don't know that I agree with that, but that's the point. We can look at the same body of work, the same incident, and come up with different conclusions. And this is what happens here in Numbers 13 and 14, is there's 12 spies sent into the land that God said, I will give to you. Now it's very interesting, if you go back and think about Old Testament history, this is a fairly common phrase for God's people. Later on in Joshua 5 and 6, you're going to see that God tells Joshua about the land of Jericho in the beginning verses of Joshua chapter 6. I have given this land into your hands. Now, of course, it wasn't theirs yet. They had to march around. They blew the trumpets, and they had to fulfill God's word to receive his blessing of defeating that fortified land. But God, when God said, I will give this to you, he did, as long as the people gave in to his will. So when we're going through this tough time, I want today's lesson to be a lesson in optimism, not just in some sort of feel-good American 21st century, let's look on the bright side kind of way, but in a we know verse 2, God will take care of us way. And know that when we look back on this time, all the stress that's going on, we will have fond memories. I know to some extent that's pretty easy for Koshka and I to say. We're in a house by ourselves. We're not in a full home. And probably the more people you have, the more you're looking forward to stretching your legs a little bit. But I will share this story. When I was 12 or 13, we sold our home, and my grandparents sold their home, and we all moved into one bigger home so that my mom didn't have to drive back and forth across town 4 times a day to take care of them. They were in their upper 80s. And while they were in reasonably good health, disease, flu, any of those things are a problem for someone approaching 90. And that was the one flaw in the house. There was a master suite downstairs where they could stay, in the kitchen and living room, so that was perfect. And upstairs, there was 3 bedrooms, which worked for my parents and my one sister and I to be in different bedrooms. But that one flaw came out one time when we got the flu. And when I say we got the flu, I mean it knocked me out, it knocked my sister out, it took my dad out, and then it even took my mom out. And any of you know, when mom goes down, that's the real problem. Now, the fatal flaw is the kitchen was downstairs, and no one with the flu that is clearly contagious can go downstairs and possibly infect Mimi and Papa. Right? So that's a problem. And so what we did was, for a week, we stayed upstairs as a family. And so if you think it's bad being in a huge home by yourself with just your whole family, imagine being in about 500 square feet of a living room, maybe, and then your own bedrooms, and that's it for 7 straight days. Imagine how wonderful that would be. Now, at the time, all you want to do is feel better, and you just want to move on. But one thing I can tell you moving forward from that event is that I remember some of the good memories. I do remember everyone being sick, but I also remember that we watched a movie series together as a family. It was rare that we all had that kind of time to sit together. Sound familiar? And now anytime I hear music from that set of movies, I kind of think of that time. I think of the flu, many happy memories. I think of the time I spent with family. I think of the time that we were able to bond together and enjoy something as a family in an otherwise chaotic world. I think we can see some similarities in the flu back then versus the pandemic now. Let's make the best of our time, but also realize God's going to get us through, and that God has a plan for us. Now, it may not be the way we understand it. It may not be even how we want it to be, but there is a plan and we will get through. The question is, how will we look at the circumstances in the meantime, though? And that's really what the problem is. When you think about the story of the spies here, they went and they saw the land. Now, notice going back to verse 17, Moses says, go up and go into the hill country, see what the land is. And specifically, to be fair to them, he says, see whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. And of course, when you think about their message, it was good for the most part. In verse 26, they come back and they brought word and they showed them the wonderful fruit. Verse 27, we came to the land which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So there's the good news. This is the promised land. It is just as good as advertised. That's a rare thing. But then there's these terrible notes in 28 and 29. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Verse 29, the Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb, and even going down to the end of that phrase, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. And so let's be fair to the circumstance. This would be pretty terrifying if you're a nation of people who really aren't warriors. They've done some wonderful things and they've escaped Egyptian bondage, and they're more familiar with this type of lifestyle than we would be. But this is pretty scary. And verse 28 is true. I want to be very clear as we think about how to look at our circumstances. Just pretending that bad things don't exist doesn't make it better. Not feeling despair, not being afraid, that's not really being a human being. Right? We see all of those emotions in the Bible story. We see fear, discouragement, pain, anger. We also see happiness and encouragement and love. Right? But these are all real. And when we read 28, let's not go through the story and say, oh, it shouldn't have mattered. They should have focused on God only. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, it's true. But you would still be afraid. I would be afraid if I went and saw giants in the land that I was supposed to go take militarily by force. That would be scary. But also true is verse 27, that the land does flow with milk and honey, that the fruit was amazing. It was as good as advertised. And so the real question is, where will their focus be? That they see good and they see bad. Will they admit there's both? Will they focus on the positive, or will they focus on the negative? Right? Because that's going to be our choice. We just have evidence. We just have life. What will we do with it? Will we see the positive, the negative, or maybe try to call out some of both? Well, of course, really what you see from the 12 spies is a distinct divide. You have the 10 that have one view and 2 that have a different view. Caleb speaks for himself in Joshua in verse 30, essentially, when he says, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Caleb says, we can do it. And of course, we know from chapter 14, Joshua and Moses and Caleb understand with God, all things are possible. But that's not the way everyone saw it, of course, is it? In verse 31, then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out. And what they say, well, the land of ours, its inhabitants, there's giants there. We have no hope. We have no shot. Let's just give up now. Now, of course, there's a lot of context that makes this really upsetting to hear. One is, remember, where did they come from ultimately? As Moses is leading them, what's Moses' big story? That he had the encounter not once, not twice, 10 times with Pharaoh, right, in the 10 plagues. They were in bondage. They were slaves in Egypt. So any opinion they have is against the backdrop of being slaves in Egypt or being around the distance between Egypt and here in Canaan in the Promised Land, basically wandering. Not quite what we'd call the wilderness wandering, but still wandering, migrating through this land. No real home, nowhere to stay, and their other home left them in bondage. Now they look at this and they say, nope, no chance. We don't have a shot. And so you see, really, people do have both. And if we look around at our world today, we see that people have both. But the question is, what would the nation of Israel do? What would they do as a whole? Well, chapter 14, here it is. And I'm sure you didn't have to think too hard about what they would do. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel, here it is, shocker, grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now again, let's be really fair-minded for a moment and say that this is scary. Again, imagine if our congregation, and I know some people are more equipped than others. I would want Eric on my team for this, for example. But some of us aren't really ready to go into battle with people who are giants and militarily trained. Right? That's not a winning formula. Now, we know if God said, I will give it to you, we should have faith and we could do it. And that's about the only way I would win some sort of military conquest like that, is with God's help. And so this is realistic. This is a fear. But notice the way they have changed what God's purpose is. And this is their fatal flaw. Did you see it? It was real quick in verse 3. It's not just that there's giants there. It's not that we're going to die. It's verse 3. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Go back to chapter 13 with me again and look back at verse 2. What did God do? What did God send them into the land for? Verse 2, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. You see, that's the problem. It's not pop psychology. It's not optimists have better lives, although it's probably true. It's not that we should avoid negativity because it harms relationships, although it's probably true. It's that when we get into a bubble of negativity, that's all we see. That's all we focus on. And we sometimes can pervert God's plan, right? God said, you go into the land and I will give it to you. And the people said, what is God doing to us? He wants us all to die. Do you see that that's a problem? That's not just a negative worldview. That's a huge faith problem. And so our outlook actually is a manifestation of our faith. And we have to work through that if we have doubts. And this is reasonable. There were scary people there. There was good fruit there, but the people are fixated on the negative. And so we have to see, well, what are they focusing on? What is the majority focusing on? Well, first of all, they're focused on those dangers, right? Those ever-present, very real giants, right? Going back again to chapter 13 and verse 32, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all its people were of great height that we saw there. And that's pretty scary. But you know what they're not talking about in chapter 14, 1 through 5, or in chapter 13 besides Caleb? They're not talking about God propelling them to victory. They're not talking about how good the land would be if and when they did have the victory. No, there's none of that. There's only a fixation with the negative. It's, we're never going to get out of here. We're going to die. Verse 3, our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Of course, we're going to die by the sword. The men, the warriors, the women and children are going to get used in a way that is terrible. We should go back to Egypt. Now, let's stop there again, chapter 14, the last part of verse 3. All right, we're going to go back to Egypt. It would be better if we were in Egypt. Remember, what was life like in Egypt? They were in bondage. They were slaves. That's not a great life. That's how perverted the thinking had got. You know, it'd be better for us to go back into slavery, at least where we get our square meals a day, so to speak, than to be bold and to move forward into this promised land. Now, by the way, I do want to stop and continue before we add one more point on this. It's very easy to get disgruntled and discouraged or make fun of the Israelites here. There's really no reason from an older New Testament point of view, though, to think that we wouldn't be just like that. I'd love to think I wouldn't be like that. I'd like to think I'm Caleb, I'm Joshua, right? Or Moses in the story. And I hope we are. I hope everyone listening to this lesson, everyone who reads Numbers 13 and 14 is Joshua or Caleb. And we're going to see more from Joshua near the end of the lesson. I hope we are. But the truth is sometimes, if we're honest, pretty much everyone is one of the majority. And by the way, if you notice, the majority has a way of cycling more into their grasp. It's bad enough that it was 10 spies saying the negative thing and only 2 on the positive side. But once you get the whole majority, what happens? Verse 4, they're even willing to overchange everything. Let's just get a new leader, right? Moses is the problem. He let us out here. It's his fault. And of course, can't skip over verse 1 and 2 that they're weeping and grumbling as usual. Right? But notice they also focused on how hopeless their cause was. And I think this is the biggest crime of all, paired with their phrase in verse 3 that the Lord is doing this. Right? God just wants us to die. That was obviously not true. But this is the danger of the negative preoccupation. Right? This is the problem when we don't focus on positive and see God's hand. We decide that, yes, the bad parts are real, and we should acknowledge that. But you don't dwell on them, ignore the positives, and ignore the fact that God will get you through. That's exactly what the Israelites did, though. You see, it's one thing to be realistic. It's another to be pessimistic, and it's another to be faithless. Right? Those are a descending platform of descriptions. A lot of times people meet Koshk and I, and they see us, and it's very obvious between which of us is more optimistic and which is more pessimistic. But I don't prefer the term pessimistic. I prefer the term a realist. Right now, the problem with that is sometimes reality is tough. And right now, what our country is facing is very real, very tragic. And if you know people who are on the front lines of this or have been infected with this disease or passed away, as I know some people, for example, who have been impacted by it in the New York area and other places, this is real. And it doesn't matter what the statistics say. It's like what James Spann and many other weather people often say about hurricanes or tornadoes. There might only be one house affected, but if it's your house that's caught up in the tornado, you'll remember that storm forever. Right? It's real. There are tough parts of life, but the question is, will we dwell on them and let that negativity win, or we realize that God can pull us out and that there's really nothing to fear while we're here? Right? That's going to be the question. Where do we fixate? Where do we focus? It's important to see all the facts, but it's most important to focus on the God who can get us through. And so the question really is, what do I focus on in my life, and not just in the COVID-19 world, although certainly I hope you see the ready application there. Do I see the land or do I see the giants? Right? Am I focusing on the good parts of this? Am I focusing on the family time I'm hopefully enjoying? Am I fixated on the time that I can shine my light in a time where otherwise I might not have had an opportunity? Or am I just seeing the depressing, soul-crushing news cycle over and over and over again? Right? Sometimes the right thing to do to stop seeing the giants is quit looking. Right? I'm not saying don't be informed. I'm not saying don't pay attention to what's going on. It's important to know what's going on. It's very important to use what is happening to communicate with and make relationships with people to teach them about Jesus. But sometimes it might mean I need to turn the news off and open up the Word of God more. I need to see that God wins. The news doesn't care about that narrative. The news cares about selling. The news cares about attention. The news cares about ratings. And you know what drives ratings? The giants, the scary, the frightening. But when I look at my Bible, I see that God takes his people to conquer Jericho, to conquer the promised land after the wilderness wanderings. I see that Jesus came into this form, even though he was persecuted and crucified, he wins by being resurrected from the dead, as the Hebrew writer says in chapter 2, defeating the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. My God always wins. And so when he says, I have given this into your hand, I need to know it is done. The question is, will I faithfully follow orders or not? What am I focusing on? I have a question then. Even if I see the giants, am I taking that next step from realist to pessimist or to faithless? Do I let the giants frighten me? Again, it's very real to feel fear. If you read the Psalms, there's all kinds of emotions that are felt, some positive, some negative, and maybe some that we wouldn't want to emulate, but they're real. And giants are real. Struggles are real. Tragedy happens far too often than it should. People often say, if you're at the top of life right now, if not a lot's going wrong, that's great. Enjoy it and get ready because the valleys of life are coming. But if you're in the valley, please focus and realize that you get to hopefully have your time to ascend very soon. The question isn't, will there be peaks and valleys? The question is, will I trust God through them all? Will I stay faithful and realize that I have him to thank all my good news for when I'm doing well? And will I stay faithful and trusting when things are bad? Remember, the Israelites turned on God when it looked like things weren't in their favor. They're like, oh, God just wants us to die. He wants us to die by the sword. Our women, our children are going to be preyed upon. We might as well just go back to Egypt before God got involved in this mess, as if that was a real thing. Do I let the giants frighten me? That's a question that I have to answer individually. Is this something that is departing me from my God? Is this causing a divide between me and my family, or me and my God? I need to know that God wins. And if I'm not convinced of that, there's an easy way to be. Read the word. See that God always wins. His purpose always comes into fruition. And by the way, these people, these stubborn, grumbling, complaining people, they don't necessarily get the promised land. But you know who eventually did? Still God's people. Future generations. Israelites did inherit the promised land. Led by Joshua, they did conquer. They did get the land. God always wins. And so really I have this question. It sounds kind of funny, but I think it's a good example. You've probably heard it before. I want to ask everyone, are you a thermometer or a thermostat? Now, thermostats mean more here, I think, than they do in Florida. In Florida, really, a thermostat was only meant to keep your house cold. Right? You didn't really worry about it getting cold. You just kind of set it at whatever temperature you felt best upon, anywhere from 68 to 77, of course. And you just let it sit, because the 1 or 2 weeks a year it's cold, no big deal. Just enjoy the free electricity boost. Right? But here the thermostat's very important. Learn that fast. The other week when it was about 80 something, we had turned it down to be cool. And then the next day it was like 50 somehow. Not quite sure how that happened. And I hadn't changed the thermostat because I'm used to everything just spiking back up immediately. And that's not what happened here. And by the way, we enjoy that. But thermostat's important because what does it do? It controls the temperature in the room, in the house. Now, a thermometer just tells you what the temperature is. It is reflective of the situation around, or as we might say it from an application point of view, it's like the majority. Right? What is the temperature in the room? Right? There's a difference. And the question is, what kind of person am I? What is my faith like? Am I someone that can look at a situation that has the fruit and land that flows with milk and honey and see the giants and realize God still wins? Or am I the kind of person that says, no, that's something scary. I'm going to reflect that fear and I'm going to go into my turtle shell and wait for everything to get magically better, or blame God in the process. Right? There's a difference. And when Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, we are to be lights into the world, that others may see our good works and glorify our Father who is in heaven, we aren't called to be thermometers. We're called to be thermostats. We need to change the world around us. And that means first and foremost, I have to be changed. I have to realize that my God will win. And by the way, have you heard me say that once or twice? That's the good news. There's nothing to fear, because God wins ultimately. That doesn't mean there's not pain in the process, but it does mean I can make a difference. And for people around me, maybe who are on the fence, if I am a strong thermostat, maybe I can bring them with me. Maybe we can be arm in arm on God's side. Maybe Caleb doesn't have to be alone. Caleb has Joshua. Maybe Joshua and Caleb don't have to be alone. There's Moses and Aaron. As you read in chapter 14 and verse 5, Moses and Aaron try to plead with the people. Notice, then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with them. Do not fear them. Now, of course, in verse 10, it's not what they did. The congregation says, well, I guess we should stone them because we disagree. Right, but did you notice? Don't rebel against the Lord. The Lord removed their protection. The Lord will let us win. We need to control the temperature around us. We need to control what we see and control our hearts. So I want to conclude with 3 points here. How can I see God's plan? How can I know that, as Joshua would say, the Lord delights in us in this way? Well, the first one is a passage we've cited many times and will continue to while we are facing this type of crisis, is in Matthew 6. We need to remember what he's promised. Look at Matthew 6:33. You probably know it, but I encourage you to look there. It never grows old of hearing. In Matthew 6 and verse 33, in response to a desire of Jesus to convince us we don't need to be anxious. In fact, it's wrong to worry about even the most basic necessities of this life. He says, verse 33, I hope you see it, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Right? The key in the book of Numbers 13 and 14 and understanding the spy story is all the way back in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 13. Right? Yes, the 12 spies went to the land. Yes, that they saw the land was good and they shouldn't have feared. The reason they shouldn't have feared, the reason they went to the land in the first place is what? From Numbers 13, verse 2. God said, I am giving this land to my people. If they remembered like Caleb, if they recalled like Joshua, if they remembered God's leadership like Moses and Aaron, they would know God had promised them the land. And so there was no reason to worry. It didn't matter how they got there. Jericho is a very weird story of military conquest. Right? There are some bloody battles that Israel won. And there are also very weird battles that Israel would win because God doesn't work the way we think he should all the time. In fact, he works beyond. His plans are better. His plans are greater. He can do, as Ephesians says, far more abundantly in verse 20 and 21 than all that we ask or think. That's God. And what has God promised us? We don't have to worry about the things of this life, not because things will be rich, not because things will go the way I think, but because God will take care of our needs. And most importantly, he'll take care of our greatest desire, which should be to be with him. It's so important that we remember the death of Jesus every Sunday, not just because of the example in the New Testament, although that's true. Not just because Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, although that's important. It's because Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is a sign and a confirmation of everything that should matter. That there's a life worth living, and because of his sacrifice, we can live that life. Not just in this world, but in the one to come. We don't have to worry. We don't fear the person who can take away the life or who can inflict fear upon our bodies. Fear the one who can kill the soul. Right? That's what Jesus would teach in Matthew chapter 10. That's the type of lesson we need to keep in heart and mind. God will always keep what he's promised. And that should be great news, not terrifying news. Second thing is we need to be willing to look and see the good things. Let's look in Colossians chapter 3. We left this point from the beginning. But in the beginning, we mentioned the fact that there's only evidence. There's not Christian evidence or atheistic evidence. There's not just good fruit. There's also giants. There's not just giants. There's also good fruit. But when we see the blessings that he's done, I think one way to help see God and his plan to stay positive, even while we're in this life and fixated on this world, we need to see what God has already done for us. All right, before we read Colossians 4, would you consider the idea that the people of Israel should have already trusted in God, not just because he said to, although that should be enough, but because what had he already done? Think to yourself for a moment, what has God already done for the people? Well, he worked the 10 plagues. I hope maybe you're thinking of the parting of the Red Sea, the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, the giving of the 10 commandments. I mean, what miracle has God not done for the people to witness and to know if we stick with God, we're good? They should have already seen what God had done, but they weren't fixated on that. They fixated on the negative. What can we look at? Well, in Colossians 4, in verse 2 and 3, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Do you see that phrase in verse 2? Even in the midst of imprisonment, as we read about, be watchful in prayer, and do so how? With thanksgiving. How do I do that? What does it mean to be watchful? Well, it means to be looking out for. Right? Remember in 1 Peter 5, verse 7, be sober-minded. Because what? The devil is prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking whom to devour. That means we have to be watchful. We have to be looking. In verse 2, he says, be watchful with thanksgiving and prayer. I need to look around to what to be thankful for. And by the way, you don't have to look very far. This congregation has so many wonderful examples of Christians. It's so encouraging. Just look at how the elders are working together, the deacons. Look at the service workers in the medical community. And in our policemen, and anyone and everyone who's working, mothers and fathers staying homes with their kids who are a beacon of light and such a positive influence and example and light for us in a dark time. There's so much to be thankful for. We just have to open our eyes and see it. Right? The world's not going to give it to us. Satan doesn't want us to see it, but God does. And he has blessed us with so many good things. We just need to look for it and be thankful for it. And our final point, trust God to overcome the giants. Right? If we remember what God has promised, we need to know we're taken care of. And that way, while we live, we don't have to focus on the negative because we can see the positive. But the negative is still there. The giants are still in the land. So what do we do about them? We can't just ignore them, even if we want to fixate on the good things. Well, the good news is we don't have to worry about them because God will take care of them. If you look in Romans chapter 8, and again, this is a passage we looked at Wednesday. I appreciated Patrick's Wednesday talk, and I appreciated the recommendation from Cooper. In Romans 8, though, in verse 37, knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Nothing can separate me. Nothing can separate you from the love of God. There is no giant too big, no Goliath too frightening or menacing that our God can't handle. And so I need to remember what he has promised because he is faithful. I need to see the positive and be thankful. And I can see the enemies and the scary and be watchful and not worry because my God will win. And if I trust in him, I'll win too. What a blessing to be children of God. I hope this lesson was encouraging. And as we move forward in our weeks, look for the positives, look to be thankful. And again, Koshka and I thank you for providing a wonderful example of what to be thankful for in your daily lives.